Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today, we are continuing our series on Herbert Spencer. Or, excuse me. Today, we're continuing our series of reviewing the Anarchist Handbook by Michael Malice. And the chapter we're doing this week is on Herbert Spencer. There we go. We're actually not sure how long the episode's going to go. I mean, when we say it's going to go short, we always talk for a normal length of time. Matt might have more to say on this excerpt than I do, actually. But to give a little bit of background and a little bit of my thoughts, Herbert Spencer was an English philosopher. He was around during Darwin's time. He was actually the one that came up with the phrase survival of the fittest. Everyone associates that with Darwin, but Herbert Spencer was who came up with the term. But Herbert Spencer wasn't just interested in biology. He was also interested in sociology and psychology and politics more generally. And I think, is this from the book Human Statics?
It's from Social Statics. From
Social Statics, that's it. This book is considered, I think, one of the first sort of libertarian anarchist texts. Actually, and Michael Malice says in his little excerpt at the beginning that Spencer did not consider himself to be an anarchist. So he took out this chapter apparently when he published it, but it was added back in after he died. And basically his argument in the piece is it regards one's ability to go against the state. So of course, if you're a statist or if you defend government in certain ways, the refrain is, well, the government, enforces certain rules and everybody has to follow those rules for collective, for the benefit of the collective. And Herbert Spencer he's questioning that. He's basically arguing that if you want actual liberty, you have to have the liberty. You have to have the liberty to go against the state. You have to have the liberty to refuse to obey the state. You have to have the liberty to leave the state's authority. And of course, he also goes on to talk about how a lot of the rights that the states upholds, he considers to be very arbitrary, and they go against, I think I don't have the excerpt in front of me, but he talks about, I think, the moral law. He kind of has this, he's actually a bit of a moralist in this piece. He's sort of appealing to a higher moral law or a higher moral authority and saying, if you look at what the government does, it's pretty evil most of the time. But if you actually try to live by this moral law, then you should be going against the government. I think a good place to start then this conversation is to think more about one's ability to disobey the state in various ways, because I'm not one to say that, as I said before, I'm not the Hobbesian who justifies all state authority on the grounds of collective well-being. Obviously, we can think of if some of us had been in, if some of us had, alive today, had our moral compasses, and were around in, say, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or Maoist China or something, or various or other fascist communist regimes, we want to think that, well, we would have disobeyed these governments, because despite the fact that they were governments, they were doing heinous things, they were doing what we consider to be immoral things, and that should be dealt with properly. If you don't deal with it, then more harm is done than if you do attempt to deal with it. And so I think there definitely are times when it is necessary for individuals and collectives and groups to disobey state authority. I even think it's probably, or I even would go so far as to say, I have no real issue necessarily. If we're thinking about it in the abstract, when we think about it in the concrete, it gets a little more challenging. But if we think about, say, secession in the abstract, or just leaving the state's jurisdiction in the abstract, I can't necessarily tell someone they can't do that or they shouldn't do that. I consider that an asocial act in many ways, or an antisocial act in many ways. I think the individual at that group, or at that point, or the group, and is kind of asserting themselves against the broader collective in ways that I might not be comfortable with. And I also think, if we just think about states historically, to decide, tomorrow that a group of people in Oklahoma are going to, construct Ancapistan and fight the U.S. government for their freedom. I mean, you might say they have the moral high ground if you're an ANCAP or lean that way, but I doubt that's really anything's going to come of that. So I think this is just a very interesting topic to bring up. We've actually talked in the past off air about things related to secession, like the Civil War and the Articles of Confederation and whatnot. So I think I'll let Matt jump in here.
Yeah. So there were a couple of reasons why it was really interesting. One that I'll single out to start is that this chapter, I think it was originally in the book, but then, as you mentioned, it was removed in like a further edition. And the chapter is called "The Right to Ignore the State." And I just think that word "ignore" is like kind of the crucial element of understanding what he's arguing, combined with how removed it is from 1851 to 2021. And I think that says a lot, both about like how our society has changed, but also elements of the state itself. So it is kind of hard to imagine how to resist the state in our current world. And if you're like a really online kind of ANCAP that knows a lot of what's going on in really niche circles, there are ways people are subverting it. Like, this is how people get into like crypto, and this is how people get into 3D printing things, especially firearms, right? So these are ways people have found to peacefully subvert things. But ignoring the state really is something that's like kind of, it's almost now if you read that and you're liberty oriented, it's like really funny, because it's like, how can I just ignore the state? Like, we have all these innovations, unfortunately, that have happened that make it so you really can't ignore the state. And this is how people complain about mandatory tax withholding, and all sorts of payroll taxes and all these things, that it's like you can't avoid it. So that's like a big picture interesting thing to observe, because I think it speaks to, I know some later essays in this book are kind of going to be about the parasitic nature of the state and why it grows and why it does become corrupt inherently. And I think part of why this has aged poorly for libertarians is because of that nature of the state to have grown and entered its tentacles in really everything, because now it is hard to ignore it. So that's that point there. To set that aside, I'm glad you mentioned that he really talks about a couple things in like a Hobbesian way, because I thought it was an interesting way to both like acknowledge people who have that view of the world that like men are evil and crime is like something that should be feared kind of first and foremost. And he addresses that, and then he uses their points to make an argument of sorts, which is like kind of compelling. It's at least something I really haven't seen before. But he kind of implies that like, okay, and this goes back to our conversation with Keegan, right? A lot of our conversation with Keegan on the validity of the state came to him making certain types of arguments that are Hobbesian, about, hey, you kind of to some degree need the state to protect certain freedoms. And if you think people have rights that are beyond what they can get on their own in a voluntary way, then a lot of people think you need the state to enforce those rights are guaranteed. But he kind of says, well, if the state is a service, then why can't I opt out of the service? Because all other services are things like the state is pretty much saying, we're doing you a favor, we're keeping you safe, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And he's saying like, no, I should be able to just ignore them. Like, it's okay, you don't have to keep me safe. Like, if the state is there to keep you safe and just do nice things for you, then why is it such a big deal to just say, nah, I'm good? And I think that that's like a funny kind of counter argument to people who are like, well, the state needs to guarantee this for you and this for you. And it's like, no, thank you. I'm not interested. And it makes secession not sound like a violent thing if you put it that way. It's like, no, it's okay. I'm good. You guys can carry on with your thing. I'd rather just play over here. And that is, I think, a fairly reasonable take. So I enjoyed that framing. That's not something I hadn't really ran into it, at least put that way. So I got a kick out of it.
So I guess I'm curious then. Do you think if we're applying, say, this to 2021, the idea of ignoring the state, I guess, should ANCAPs, libertarian types, liberty people, as you call them, should they be concerned more with ignoring the state rather than attempting to found Ancapistan in Oklahoma or Antarctica or whatnot? Like, because states are so pervasive right now and so powerful, is it worth your time more to try to just live your life in such a way as to not be affected by the state, rather than attempting to overthrow the state and rather than attempting to overthrow the state altogether, or attempting to create your territory, your stateless territory? It's sort of a question of strategy, but I think it's something I'm kind of interested in hearing your response to.
Yeah, and it definitely plays to the topic at hand, the idea of ignoring the state. So one thing the libertarians have historically been bad at is any sort of tactics, and because there's a minority party, I really think that people should just kind of do what they can do, and it's kind of like a thing that sucks to tell people, because generally I'm not going to say anything that might accidentally incriminate myself, so I guess I won't mention that. But there are a lot of big picture things that people want to get rid of, like mandatory taxation and mandatory withholding and certain things like that, that it's really tough to on your own, because it's like, well, you can't just get taxes eliminated, right? You can't do this. But I was talking a few days ago with some people who I guess are kind of like-minded, and I threw out the idea that a lot of laws aren't really enforced. And if they are enforced, they aren't enforced in a serious way. And there's really no reason why people should comply with those laws unless they have a good reason on their own to comply with those laws. Like I guess an example of this would be jaywalking. Like, you have a good reason to not jaywalk when there are cars coming. But if there are no cars coming, you're not going to get fined for jaywalking. In most jurisdictions, you're not going to get fined for jaywalking. So if you're not going to get hit by a car because you know you can cross the street, but you're breaking a rule on the books, then why don't you jaywalk? So that's like the first step, right? Is things that are ordinances that aren't enforced, there's no reason to abide by them for the sake of it. A lot of businesses still will, but if there's a requirement that you wear masks somewhere and you don't want to wear a mask, and you know that store is not going to force wearing a mask, there's no reason why you should arbitrarily decide to wear a mask. If they ask you to, then you can put it on. That's fine. But it's like, you shouldn't feel compelled to if you think the law is dumb and you know it's not going to be enforced. So that's step one. Step two is, and this is why I like talking about crypto a little bit, even though I'm no expert by any means. Do not ask me any tough questions that are technical. But the idea is even if the government finds a way to criminalize crypto in any way, if you make something expensive enough to enforce, then it's not in the government's interest to enforce it unless they're getting something huge out of it. Like the government is an actor that tries to do things that make sense. One of the reasons why the government doesn't crack down more on people who do tax crimes is because it costs a lot of money to enforce certain IRS codes. So unless somebody's a really big cheater on their taxes, they're not going to really crack down on them. It uses a lot of resources to do this. So you can essentially ignore the government in times like with crypto, because if the government ever was going to do something, they would need such a high amount of resources to potentially get a very small return. And if that's their incentives, then why would they do anything about it? So there's like a first and a second dimension to ignoring the government that I think is still practical. And it is outside of having to organize and then go to libertarian events and then vote out the bad libertarians and then get your good libertarians in. So then a good libertarian can run for your local office and then lose by 45 points. It's like, or you could do these little things that just says, cool, they put this dumb rule, I don't care about it. So yeah, I think that's the real strategy there.
So the experience I had reading this excerpt, actually the experience I've had reading a lot of these excerpts is, and this isn't a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination, hearing people, I guess, talk about concerns that you often, or it didn't either occur to me were concerns, or I just don't think are concerns. So I've already accepted that I think there are times to resist the state, but I've kind of determined that it's in my best interest to not to not try to go to get around the state, or to not openly fight the state, or even to go full on agorist here. Agorist, if anyone doesn't know, it kind of was what we're saying is the idea that you try to engage in transactions that, anywhere from like buying marijuana from your dealer, a couple blocks down, to, more extreme things. But it's kind of engaging with illegal markets, but not necessarily like the full on black market. There are gray markets, etc. But I think that because of I guess my worldview, or because of the conclusions I've come to about collectives being important in human life, I don't really see a reason for me to leave the state, or to leave this collective, to say, I don't want anything to do with the United States of America anymore. This is evil. In fact, I think I think my life is probably, all in all, is of greater benefit to be part of this collective than it is to be against the collective. Now that's sort of a personal, that's going a good bit on my personal life. I realize that's somewhat anecdotal and subjective. But I think that's a worthwhile point of contention that I would say to Herbert Spencer if we were like sitting in a room together. And even like, and even you, I mean, you're not you don't agree with me politically, in most of the time. But for various reasons, even you don't reject the state. You weren't part of the January 6th riots, for example. You're not leading an armed uprising. So it's like, even, and that's not necessarily defense, I realize, but even if I suddenly became an ANCAP overnight, I still don't think I would openly defy the state that much, just because there's no real will to do it, and there's no real movement to change anything at this time. And the weird thing about, if I may add one more point, when we're talking about like an evil tyrannical government, I was thinking about like kind of how the U.S. government functions, and I thought about a parallel between it and France under the Ancient regime. So historians, when they look at France under the Louis, they think, oh, it's a pretty repressive society, which in many ways it was, of course. But it was also very free in so many other ways, and a lot of things weren't enforced, and so there was a weird mix of repression and openness. So because of that, a lot of people got away with a lot of things under the Ancient regime, and life for at least the middle and upper classes was pretty pleasant on the whole, for the very reason that even though the French government was repressive, it was also very bureaucratic and ineffective and slow and almost benign in certain ways. And I sort of feel that way about the U.S. government. Now, if I'm really like honest with myself, I suppose I could say that the U.S. government is a threat to me in many ways. If Biden, I mean, this wouldn't happen, but if Biden got us into a nuclear war tomorrow with, say, Russia, it's not going to happen, but in theory that could happen, and that would obviously destroy my life. Or if there were maybe trade wars with China, like there are various things that the U.S. government could do to make my life a lot worse. But I think game theoretical reasons, the same reason that say you and I don't revolt against the state is almost the same reason why the states don't always misbehave in the ways that they would be able to do in point of fact. So that's sort of my thought process when I'm coming to this essay. Even though I might be hostile to the U.S. government, it's not necessarily as much of a threat to me as some people might think it is, at least in the short term.
I think my main, counterpoint to what you were saying, what was a point you eventually got around to. And it's like, well, I don't think this undermines anything that he laid out in his essay or anything that ANCAP say, but the idea that there aren't armed revolutions against the United States every day by ANCAPs is a matter of game theory, right? Because why would you go into a losing war? It's the same reason why neocons who are convinced there's a genocide happening in China aren't trying to drop boots on the ground in China tomorrow. And it's like, because even if there might be a few crazy ones who actually think that's an idea worth, entertaining, in general, people know it's not a good idea to go to war with another giant nation with a ton of people and an authoritarian regime with a lot of good weapons. So that's the same reason why ANCAPs won't revolt. But I think that's the beauty of the essay, and that's the beauty of the word ignore, right? So there are still little things you can do to undermine, and there have always been little things you can do to undermine any type of regime. And I think I've mentioned off air to Matt a lot that I've been reading a lot about China and China-U.S. relations. And a lot of bureaucrats in like Soviet Russia and a lot of party members in China really are selfish and against the party. And then there's all the horror stories of the people who are just covering themselves, making themselves look good, and then they get found out, and then they're, thrown out of the party. And that happens pretty often. But it's kind of like the citizen version of that. It's like, well, I am an employee, and it's like I have a productive job. And in the U.S., if the U.S. is all about growth and it's all about funding their political governmental machine, then they want me to be playing this role. But if there are any little things I can do to undermine that authority, I should be doing it. Just like those bad bureaucrats were doing. It's like, sure, I'll look good to them, but I'm really not trying to make their regime any stronger. And I think even if you don't think our government's as bad as China's or Russia, it's still a government worth undermining. The other thing I want to throw out there is when we read essays like this, and like how I mentioned how we've talked to Keegan about state legitimacy. You and Keegan make a point that I think is valid, but philosophically defending the state is very different than defending actions done by the United States government. And that is a very valid point to bring up, and it's a very valid point to say. But it's like even people on the left have very valid criticisms of the government right now because our government is a murderous imperialist machine. And they do have a lot of programs that enrich people who are already wealthy, and they keep poor people in what's the word for it, in poverty cycles. And even if I disagree on which policies do that, though the left does have an idea that this is happening, even if I think they're technically wrong about which policies are causing what problem. So at that point, it's like, even though these people are generally statist or sympathetic to statist ideas, I think these people should also be doing things to undermine the regimes that they think are hurting people's lives. Even if it's not hurting their lives, they see really bad communities in the US, and they see how bad elites rule them poorly. And for that reason alone, it's kind of like a lot of, I think what Spencer's saying kind of speaks true. It's like, if this is a regime and it's a bad regime, you should be able to ignore that regime, and you should be able to undermine it. And I think there are practical ways to put that into effect. Yeah, I do have one other kind of random thought. So let me know if I should dive into that.
Well, I just wanted to add quickly, maybe it's not worth going down this rabbit hole. You don't have to respond to this if you want to, or you can respond to it in a sentence or two and then move on to your other point. The weird thing, again, I think about, say, something an entity like the U.S. government is, I think it does benefit me and so many other people from a material perspective. Now, of course, we've had so many conversations. You would say you would say both philosophically that's bad, and if you look at the numbers, if you look at the data, all those policies are actually horrible. But supposing, okay, so here's an example. Supposing that Biden ultimately ends up giving people free community college. There's been talk about possibly trying to get policies passed or trying to get laws passed to where people get free community college. So it would be K through 14, go up to the 14th grade, so to speak. I like, and of course, Biden's argument is that it would make us more competitive in the global market. But even besides that, I think you can make a very strong argument that for the people who want to go to college, that would be a true improvement in their situation, because that means they don't have to pay for those 2 years of college. Not saying everyone has to go to college, not saying every college class or every professor is teaching you the best, or is like, giving you the best possible education that you could be having. So I mean, this is just a long way of me saying I don't think we can just say, well, the U.S. government or most modern nation states don't really improve anyone's material circumstances at all. I think that's just factually inaccurate, and I could go on to other examples, but I'll leave it there.
Well, to not go into the one example in specific, I think I just want to I want to at least introduce a mental framework that I use, because I think what you just said, I do think it was wrong. And I think one of the reasons it was wrong is because I don't think it actually contends with how policy should be thought about. So the way I think policy should be thought about and discussed is through the lens of opportunity costs, and then something that you've probably heard of in physics or chemistry, which is the idea of delta, which is the change, right? So every policy needs to be compared to what would happen if you didn't do that policy. So the real effect of a policy is the net delta effect, however you want to describe it. So, and then there can be short-term effects and there can be long-term effects. So I guess just to elaborate on your example, you'd have to take into account how many people would go into this, and then in the long term, if that would devalue that degree. You'd have to look into other effects on the education. So, like, would community college education standards stay the same or lower? Would people find associate's degrees meaningful? I mean, as far as I know, in the job market, having an associate's degree isn't actually even that good. It would just prolong the journey to going to a 4-year college to do your last 2 years. So it's like you'd have to compare the status quo versus that, and then saying you're giving people this opportunity undersells all the costs that go into making it happen. Because to fund a policy, you have to put money into it in the first place. So it's like, okay, well, what would this money do if it wasn't funneled into this policy? What would that affect you? Because now this money will not be spent the way it would be spent otherwise. So there are other tailwinds, or there are headwinds that coincide with the tailwinds. You have to measure it out. So every policy is opportunity cost. And you actually have to care about what the true delta of these policies are. Every policy that's presented to you by people on TV or anybody who champions a policy only tell you the tailwinds and the benefits of those. They don't actually contend with how marginal the effects are versus how large the costs can be. And then they usually oversell the tailwinds of the policy because they have an interest in that. They're an advocate for it. So a lot of things you said didn't acknowledge both the opportunity costs that would go into putting that policy in effect and how this could cause diluting effects and how it might not actually be as good as it sounds on the surface. That's why policy is a horror show anytime you try to discuss it. That's a mental framework that I think is like invaluable and has to be taken seriously. And that goes to like the seen and the unseen, which is by Bastiat. Like, that's the whole idea. That's why economists nowadays are useless, because they tell you what's happening and they don't actually compare it to anything. They say, oh, we're doing a $300 billion investment in these industries, but then they don't say, how that results compare against what happened if you didn't do it, and then do a holistic approach. It's literally just A, B. It doesn't take into account anything else. So I think that's a huge problem in political discourse.
May I give one more example? If I may. Now, again, this is another example, or this is an example from my personal life. I'm not going to go into too much detail, of course, but my family, when I was young, was not able to afford. And I should preface this. This is not going to talk about Delta or really even opportunity cost that much. So I recognize you can reject it on those grounds that I'm not answering that objection. So my family, when I was younger, was not able to afford me privately. Like, they weren't able to pay for my healthcare out of their pocket. They just couldn't do it. There wasn't money on the table for it. So I've had healthcare, and I'm 21 now. So I've had healthcare through the my state for my whole life. And you can make, again, we can talk about whether or not certain policies in the certain policies would be better or worse, whether it's private health insurance entirely, or universal health care or whatnot. But I could just tell you, and I think it's important, actually. I think this anecdotal example is relevant insofar as I think it is important for policies, when we're talking about policies, to hear how they affected the lives of individuals. I don't think that's irrelevant. People aren't always the best judges of their own lives, but I don't think it's entirely irrelevant to hear how certain things affected people in certain ways. And I'm sure it's certainly true that my life was overwhelmingly better because the government gave me health care. And I think it's a separate conversation from, in my opinion, Matt, private health care all the way down is preferable. Even if that's true, I think government-run healthcare is better than absolutely no healthcare whatsoever. And when I was a little kid, I got sick all the time. Like, I got strep throat all the time, and that can cause serious complications if you don't get the proper antibiotics. So I guess I think there are other ways to look at policy besides the ways that you mentioned, and that can, I believe, it reinforced my argument that the U.S. government is not doing me, not just causing material harm for myself and others, and can be beneficial.
I mean, I interpret that story as, if the government starts a fire, they can put out some of the small fires they started. But like, I work in a job that is pretty tied into healthcare, and saying that the government, I know the United States government doesn't pay for everybody's healthcare, but to imply the government doesn't essentially centrally plan our healthcare system is mincing words, based on how many different institutions are purely funded by people's Medicaid payments, and Medicaid payments depend on rates in all sorts of states. And depending on what a state sets a rate for a certain procedure, completely dictates their revenue. And your revenue and your profit dictates how much everything costs, and it dictates who you can hire and who you can't hire and what you can provide. So I guess I would say, well, yeah, the healthcare is centrally planned. And it's like, now, if you take your example and you take the essence of it in a Jordan Peterson type way, and you talk about somebody who like needs something that they can't afford it in general, and then you say, and the government was able to give it to them, then it's like, yeah, but then it's like, this is the whole point of the seen and the unseen, is because that story isn't complete. Because like, why could the government give it to them? And it's like, that story is a good story, but it's an incomplete story. And that's why it's often used by political actors to push their agenda, whether they believe their agenda is benevolent or not. It's an incomplete story. So I would say it's why, and we were before the show, we were talking about human interest pieces, and you like when things are grounded in the people. But that's why I think NPR and American public media are like almost malevolent, is because they'll talk about one person, and then they'll use it and then they'll say, and this is illustrative of a current economic narrative about what's going on in the world. And it's like, you interviewed one person. It's like, if you're drawing grand narratives off one person's experience, you're hiding the ball. There's more to the story, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's why it's the seen and the unseen. It's always two sides. So yeah. Okay, I think we beat that part dead. I was going to bring up one other little thing on the broad topic, and that is it's a topic we've treaded before, but I guess I want to bring it up and pose it as a question of a bit, and this goes back to Herbert Spencer's piece. He really hates on authoritarians, but he also does give more credit to democracies than I think I've been willing to in the past. But he kind of almost, the way I conceptualized what he was saying was I imagined a sliding scale, and he pretty much says like if 100 out of 100 would be like legitimate. So he's like willing to cede that a dictator is like a 0 and that 80% agreement in a democracy is like an 80. So he is like willing to grant that like, hey, I'm okay with this. He's not saying he's okay with it, but he's saying like 80% of people are okay with it, and he's willing to recognize that's better because at least 80% of people agree with it. I was wondering how you conceptualize all that, given, I guess, the idea that you're more amenable to the idea of the people in democracies making decisions about government, and also given the fact that he laid out the easy and the hard answers, which was like the 0% dictator and like the 80% democracy. But most of our democracy has been like 52 to 58%, unless you're in, except like on a national level. On state levels, it can be much higher. So I guess I was wondering if that's something that's interesting to you in any way, of like having very broad popular support in a nation or in a state, and if there's any meanings or takeaways from that, or if those mean anything. Is a 51 as good as a 70? And if not, why not? You know, that's kind of what I was thinking about.
So to draw a parallel between what we're talking about and U.S. history, the founding of the country, particularly because what people like James Madison said when they were like constructing the Constitution and writing their polemics in favor of it and whatnot, they're like, we're trying to create a system which protects the minority from the majority. Because he was like, I mean, Chomsky mentioned this in his lecture, like, okay, you know, the majority is going to take to vote to steal the minority's property. So we have to create a system which protects the minority's property against the unruly majority that want to socialize everything. Madison wouldn't have put it in those words, of course. I just think it's very interesting. I guess if we think about majorities and minorities, at some point, and I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but perhaps when we're thinking about when we're thinking about groups of people, you're kind of by definition having to decide between either, okay, do I go with, you know, just letting the majority decide what, you know, happens, or the minority. So it's like under a dictatorship. It's like the minority is deciding. The dictator and maybe a few of his lackeys and whatnot, they're deciding what's going on. Or if you take, you know, if you take a republic, more like the United States, it's like you could argue that. Well, actually, no. That's a bad example, actually, because it's not. So say when we're electing president, we don't actually do it by who gets the most votes. So that's even a bad example. But you know, you hear people talk about how like, okay, most people when you poll them say, I know you're not a big fan of polls, but if you poll people, they say, okay, we prefer universal health. We would prefer a universal healthcare system. And then a political commentator like Kyle Kunsky says, okay, well then if we want an actual democracy, meaning a government that's supposed to be serving the interests of the people, serving what most people want, we should have universal health care. I guess I don't see a way around that. That might just be a fundamental tension, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, but that might just be a fundamental tension in human relations. Because I even think in Ancapistan, it would probably just be, maybe I shouldn't go down that road. But I don't think Ancapistan gets away from the majority-minority dichotomy. I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because I don't think any human society probably can get away from that.
Yeah, I think Ancapistan dodges it in the sense that it's the power is decentralized, so it doesn't matter if you're unpopular as long as you're not doing the unpopular things in other people's jurisdictions, and everybody's jurisdiction is their house or something of the sort. I I think that's the best concise answer. Okay, so I have a clarifying question, and I think that clarifying question is something along the lines of there is arguably, and that maybe this will bring out either some radicalism or some institutionalism in you. But I'm curious. The idea of a two-party system or a multi-party system is good in the sense, or it's arguably good in the sense that it keeps people from doing things that are crazy. You have opposition that is relatively strong that can keep you in check. But this is also why you generally see incrementalist policy happen, because there is another party there and they don't want to go too far because then there might be a huge correction back. So to have a threatening minority party, it needs to be like a 55-45 split in that realm, or else you don't really have a viable minority party. Or if you're talking about pluralities, like in 5 countries, you need another one in striking distance. But that also is what keeps things from, enacting the popular will, as maybe Kyle Kulinski would say, about universal healthcare. Because, well, if there is a minority party that might be in striking distance and might take all of our seats in 2 years, we don't want to put something in that's radical if we're actually afraid that people don't want it in the way we're conceptualizing it. So I guess it's like there's this tension of consenting and voting for the leaders that are in charge, but also we need those leaders to be in check. The voters keep them in check. So we don't want too much unity, or else they'll just get elected every time, right? And then you might as well be China if everybody knows they're going to win an election every year because they have so much universal support. So it's kind of like, I guess what I'm positing is you need other parties to keep a check on power, but that also means people you disagree with will always be a hand's width away from power. And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Does that raise any thoughts for you?
It raises a lot of sappy institutionalist thoughts, I suppose. About the party thing. I mean, just one offhanded comment. I think if you had, you could have a multi-party system if people were willing to form coalitions. So multi-party systems, because people in the U.S. say, well, we have a two-party system and that's better than what, say, England has, because they're just all, all those crazy parties are all over the place and they never get anything done. But of course, many people would argue that the issue with the U.S. government is specifically that you have this two-party system that doesn't allow for any other ideas, doesn't allow for left-wing populist ideas, doesn't allow for more libertarian ideas. I've used the term manufacturing consent before, but it's a very narrow window of argument that you can have. So I think I would be in favor of a multi-party system, and then those parties that have similar interests in certain things just would form coalitions, form alliances. So it's like if the Green Party and the Libertarian Party were actually viable parties in the U.S., which I would be totally okay with. Like the Democrats and the Green Party say, and the even Libertarian Party, that they could form a coalition to get marijuana legalized and to smash the Republican Party's. Although the Republican Party is getting a little better about that, but for the most part, the Republican Party is still pretty hostile to that idea. And so you could form coalitions to get the marijuana legalization passed, which would be a very good thing indeed. But did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I have a confounding thought. And this is me just kind of riffing, just to be a little devil's advocate. It's relevant and a different phrase brought up. So you just kind of said, well, Republicans have kind of sometimes been less bad on marijuana. Well, the real reason why is because there are caucuses within both parties. And because there are caucuses within both parties, it's almost like the party itself is a coalition. The amount of peoples in each caucus in the party is almost like the third and fourth parties in our government, right? But then their coalition is the Democrats and their coalition is the Republicans. This is why there's a big movement in the libertarian side of things that Though Bishop is really pushing, and he's essentially wants a Mises caucus in the GOP, right? So the LP. Because if you have a Mises caucus of the GOP, well, if they win their primary, then they might actually get elected, and then you might as well have an ANCAP in GOP garb. and they'll consensus build generally with Republicans, but for all intents and purposes, it's a Mises caucus, dude. And that would be a big improvement over what we have now. So since our system is biased towards Republican versus Democrat fights, I am a little bit amenable to the reframing of the caucuses in each party battling out in the primaries is really the Green Party fighting with the Justice Democrats, fighting the establishment Democrats. Those are really three different parties. And then they just coalition build on most things unless it's really push comes to shove. Unless it's like a real deal breaker. I don't know. Does that mean anything to you?
I mean, I don't really think that works in practice. So in other words, it's like, yeah, is Bernie Sanders the more like left wing? Is he part of the left wing of the Democratic Party, meaning farther left than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama? Is AOC part of that left wing? Is the squad part? Like, yeah, of course, I understand Joe Manchin and AOC. They're kind of different parts of the Democratic Party, and you could find parallels in the Republican Party as well. But I don't think, and I don't mean to romanticize, say, multi-party systems either, but I don't think we really have coalitions in the same way, just because certain, the fringes of the both parties, or like even the people in both parties who kind of just think differently from the establishment, don't really get much of a say. They don't really enact that much change. They do a little bit. They have some power. I'll grant you that. But they don't really enact that much change to the point where I wouldn't really call it a coalition. But I wanted to add another point. Thinking more about, you meant like majorities and minorities again. And so I fully expect, if I'm part of a collective, I fully expect there will be a great deal of disagreement within that collective. Right. So my co-host here has brought up Michael Malice's idea before of like a peaceful divorce, like there are, two countries in this one country, they're Republican and Democrat, and like they're so opposed to each other that we should just kind of separate. And like the Republicans, I guess in Malice's view, Republicans can have I guess he'll like that country more. He'll hate the Democrat country and like, all this stuff. But I actually don't think, and I'm not commenting on this from a moral perspective, but I am saying I'm more than willing to have people that radically disagree with me within a collective that I'm a part of, and we'll have those disagreements. We'll fight out those disagreements in the political arena, or we'll have conversations, or we can campaign. At some point, of course, one side generally wins, and I don't think that means the other side has to give up. So the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party, they lost. Shocker. Have they given up? Like, heck no. Like, that's like, you can keep on trying. That's fine, and I welcome that. So I actually reject this idea of a peaceful divorce. I reject this idea that to be part of a collective, everyone has to agree, everyone has to have a hive mind and group think and participate in group think. I think part of being I think being part of a collective kind of implies that you will have disagreements among the collective, and you just duke it out as best you can. And if you lose the battle, try again. You keep on going. I certainly wouldn't think that the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, I don't think they should give up, because a lot of their they haven't been terribly successful on certain things as of late. And I also don't think that means they have to found their own country because Trumpian Republicans disagree with them. I think I guess what I'm trying to say is it's kind of a very simplistic view to think that people have to agree to be part of the same collective, or to even be part of the same country or nation state. I don't think it's ever happened. I don't think it ever will happen.
Do you think your well-being and people who have similar thoughts about, I guess, how the government should run, do you think your well-being and their well-being would be better if the political landscape was what it is now, but just shifted 8 ticks to the left on every issue?
I'm probably falling into a trap here, but I'll take the bait. Yes, I think it would be better.
And do you think people who like have the opposites of you would have a better well-being if their political discourse was just 8 ticks to the right?
I think they would actually. Because I've evaluated that. I think quite a few of the policies that I'm in favor of. Well, here's the thing. I mean, we talked about this before. Trump, there were like yards in front of there were yards where you could see like Trump and Bernie signs, in the same yard, not in different yards. So actually, I think, and people like Cristobal and Sager and Jetty have talked about this. If you actually look at, I think the material conditions could be improved for both Republicans and Democrats if many of the policies that I've talked about on this show were implemented. But that just goes back to, I think a lot of people often are arguing against their own interest. And it goes back to just the narrow level of discourse, the manufactured amount of disagreement we can have. Oh, you can only have a little bit of disagreement. So it's like, with healthcare, it's like no one really in the establishment, no one really thinks universal healthcare is ever going to happen. The most radical you can do is a public option, which is not very radical, by the way. But that's like the most radical position you can have, supposedly. So I think that's also a part of it. I think if there were more free thought, if there were more, I won't say free speech, but if there were more, if more ideas were represented within the establishment, then I think many people on the right could be convinced to change their mind on a variety of subjects.
Okay, so what I was getting at was kind of like I think it's a simple contention, but I think it's like the true core of, I guess, the idea of balkanization or any kind of secession. And it's just that the national discourse and having a national government means that on any issue, if you look at like the acceptable opinion, you can always bracket it out where it's at. And generally it's shifting in the direction over time towards more government involvement. Though there are times where it recedes, there are times where it moves more in one way suddenly. All those arguments can be made. But I think the arguments that a lot of people on the left, and I'm not saying you, because I don't want you to say, well, I have this enlightenment ideal that I want to see happen in practice. But like a lot of people who are, I guess, less philosophical about it that are on the left, especially if you think about the people who like dunk on post-capitalism on Twitter, people like that, they would rather live in a society where the political debate is between people on the left, and then the closest thing to a right-winger is Nancy Pelosi. And that's like as far right in their society as you get. And if you had balkanization, then that's what places like Boston, Massachusetts might look like, or something like that, where it's like you have people who are the right-wingers or left-wingers. And that's okay, because the people who live there, that is more representative of how they view the world. And then and even though like I'm not a fan of that argument in terms of moral absolutes, I think it's still better than Alabama and Arkansas diluting it because we need national rules. So they dilute the Overton window in a way that makes those people less happy. Then people in Arkansas can have the Overton window on all their issues way more to the right, and they'll still have debates, because what happens every time in politics, but they'll be contended on grounds that everybody is more happy with in their state, because it's you bring it down and it's more representative. So even though it's not something that I'm morally okay with, I don't think government's legitimate, I just can't really see the case for thinking that wouldn't be better or make those people feel better about the government that represents them. And when we talk about government, I mean, I disagree with a lot of assertions anybody on the populist left would say about their policies working. And we could argue about the efficacy of their policies and if people are voting against their interests and whatnot, because I think that happens a lot. I would just say it happens a lot for people on the left, right? So So we could squabble over that. But I'm more getting at, for people feeling represented, feeling like their government's legitimate, if that was something that you'd want, and you want people's views to be represented in the policy that affects them on their day-to-day life, I think balkanization, in effect, is a much more practical implication of doing government in a way that would have much higher like consumer satisfaction. And I don't see a way around that, because every right-winger would rather the conversation be framed in right-wingers versus slightly less right-wingers. And every left-winger would want it to be left versus left. And that would be possible if balkanization was on the table. It's not on the table. It's not going to be on the table probably in our lifetimes. But that, I think that's the abstract case for it. And that's the abstract case for, I guess, feeling it out.
So this is, okay, so what I do on this show is I bounce from radical to institutionalist to radical to institutionalist. So I've given my radical talk or institutionalist talking points. Let me give my slightly more radical talking points. Although we're supposed to go beyond talking points. So if I give talking points, I'm not doing my job. But okay, so if we're talking about like secession and balkanization, I'm not necessarily even against that in theory, or even in practice. So it's like, well, I mean, you could argue if I'm going to defend, let's say, the American Revolution, someone could make an argument and say, well, then you were for the colonies seceding from the British Empire. If I were one to defend the American Revolution, which I suppose I am to an extent. If you feel like a government or an authority is not representing you, I can't necessarily tell you like no, but I do have I guess what the critical thought that comes to my mind perhaps is if you like if you have this like in this thought experiment, if you have a Republican country, so Republican town and Democrat town or whatever, like if you have these two countries, and if the United States breaks into two countries, we could even talk about if we should break into more countries, but let's just take two for now. I'm a good student of history, and what I would wonder is, why would I assume that those countries would be good allies? Why would I assume that one of them might not attempt to conquer the other one and impose their rule, thereby going back to the situation that we already started with? I'm not even sure it would work for just a bunch of countries on the continental United States to be in peace and harmony and not invade each other. Maybe it's possible. It might be desirable, perhaps. At some level, though, I'm very skeptical of it. And because America has this long history of manifest destiny, I would suspect that in both countries there would still be this idea, this secret imperialist wish, perhaps, to have that Republican town or Democrat town be the whole part of that, the whole chunk of North America, rather than half of it. This is the issue, of course, with, say, the Civil War, because if people were like, well, the South should have been allowed to secede, it's like, okay, but again, there would have been so many wars and conflicts, it would have blown your mind. So that would be my own like practical concern when it comes to that idea. And I think my argument would even stand if you boil it down to like 4 countries or 6 countries. I think that sounds even more likely, honestly, if there were like 6 countries and like the 6th country invades the 4th and 5th country. I mean, I guess if I may add one more quick point, I mean, historians and philosophers have often debated, like, and political scientists have debated, like, is there an ideal size for a country? Because I think a lot of people would say that perhaps in there, if you ask them, like, their ideal would be a small country, because it is easier to govern, and people do feel more like a collective. They do feel more like a community. They do feel more in touch with people, whereas I'm not necessarily that in touch with people from, say, Oregon, being from Kentucky. But that's another conversation that we could also have in the matter. I'm not necessarily against secessions or balkanization, but I would need more evidence and arguments put in favor of it before I could say I'm fully in favor of it. I'm sympathetic without being an advocate.
The thought I had, that I guess is just a different framing on something, is I was thinking about the United States federal government as a current force for imperialism and cultural hegemony. So it's like when we could talk about like secession happening, and then it's like, oh, we're worried that one is still like, it's like, oh, the Democrat side is still going to be upset that the right side, that country has outnumbers the amount of guns in the left country like 500 times to 1. That freaks them out. And it's like, well, kind of all these things are happening now, but just through national politics, right? It is where we have an area and we're saying we're unsatisfied that area's gun rights are not strict enough. Therefore, we're just going to do a federal mandate, so everybody has to come up to this line and stuff like that. So it's like to some extent, it's like I almost think instead of those wars being waged as a war, they're happening in the realm of policy. But if they couldn't do it through policy, I don't think they would manifest their ways in wars. I don't think that it's a game theory thing. I don't think anybody would go to war because the left has drag queen story hour and the right doesn't like that the left has drag queen story hour. I think it's just like there are people who are upset about it because it's happening in an area that sometimes has jurisdiction over them. So I think that's why it's like part of why it's so upsetting. And as much as we'll see a video from Africa or the Middle East where something like that is like almost, I don't want to say prehistoric, but like something like obscene is happening that is like so against what Western values of just like not attacking random people or women for certain acts. Things like that will happen, and our first thought isn't we need to go to war with that country, or we need to go to war with Mexico because some people in Mexico are doing something obscene. It's like once they lose that authority in the political realm, we just kind of shrug, and we don't usually imperialize for those reasons anymore. Like I wouldn't expect China to have a genocide on, well, I don't really think it's a genocide on Uyghurs, but they're interning the Uyghurs. And I don't think they'd be interning the Uyghurs if the Uyghurs were actually only living in Turkey. I don't think China would invade Turkey to then intern the Uyghurs. I think it's because they're in China and they don't want that culture to spread, and they want people to be afraid of having those cultural views. So I respect what you're saying, but I think it only manifests themselves in low risk situations, which is our culture war. And that's why all those divisive things turn into national policy in our culture war. But that's me, having to be a jerk about it. You can get some last words and then we'll wrap this one up because we didn't go half an hour. We managed to string an hour out of it.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit confused on one point in that I thought you were saying, because there you were kind of saying that a lot of this divide does have to do with culture wars, but then I also thought you were implying that it also is largely about policy. And if someone's pro-life and they're pro-choice, they resent having half the country being the opposite opinion, and they want to impose their laws on the other half or whatnot. So maybe you'd want to clarify that in your final statements. But the other one, well, hold on. The other point I wanted to make, I guess I'm wondering, and I've had disagreements with other people about this, not just yourself. I guess I wonder, how divided are we actually? And I guess I only ask that because okay, and I don't want to go too far down the culture wars rabbit hole, and we kind of talked about this, I think, in the last episode. It probably was, but I just don't get the sense that people are really foaming at the mouth, truly murderously angry about the another side, could disagree with them on this or that idea. And even with the culture wars stuff, I don't think it really translates into action that much. And so I guess I'm postulating that perhaps paradoxically, contrary to what someone like Michael Malice says, the country is actually more unified than we think it is. And it's not just for the game theoretic reasons of people don't want to try to overthrow the U.S. government because they're probably going to get killed. Like they're just afraid of the U.S. government, so they're not going to do anything. Just like people were afraid of Joseph Stalin, so they didn't overthrow him. Like I don't think that's actually it. I think America is not necessarily unique, but America does seem to have something about it culturally that makes it more likely to be unified than to be divided. Like the country was kind of built on unification to begin with, right? With the 13 colonies becoming a whole country, attempting to forge a national identity for itself, attempting to reject the ideas of Europe. So I'm just speculating here, of course, but maybe national divorce not only would not be practical, maybe it's not even like desired by the average person. Again, not because they're afraid, not because they're brainwashed, but because they literally like their uncle is a crazy say some left wing college student has an uncle that's a QAnon conspiracy theorist, and you scream and yell at each other over the dinner table, but ultimately even though you think your uncle's insane, you don't necessarily want to secede from your uncle. You don't necessarily want to be like, I don't ever want to see you again. I don't want you in my life. I don't want to be in the same country with you. You actually find a way to so there was some sappy story. I'll wrap up with this. There was some sappy story on NPR a while back, and it was between two people who didn't realize they were like cousins, but they turned out to be cousins. And there was like one of them, I think, was connected to the Proud Boys, I want to say, and then another was connected with like Black Lives Matter activism or something of that effect. It's a sappy story. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm like, why are you covering this NPR when there's 1,000 other things you should probably be covering instead? But it does kind of, I think it's possible that and of course these people came together, or these guys came together, and they disagree with each other extremely on various things, but they form some kind of connection somehow. And so without drawing conclusions from one story, I am, I guess, speculating that we might not be as divided as some people think we are. And I think it's the internet that would cause us to seem more divided than we are, if my hypothesis is correct.
See, okay. Well, so part of what I was getting at is if we're one country, then we have to worry about national politics. And I'm not saying everybody does. I'll get more down to if it matters for people or not. But if it's happening in Canada, we really don't care. We give like zero attention to Canada. So right-wingers that are pro-life rarely talk about Canada because it's a different country. So I guess the idea I'm positing is if it was balkanized, people would care more about what's happening in their region than they would in other regions. Because in the end, those places don't have jurisdiction over you anymore. You can sway their opinion. It'd be cool if they agreed. But in the end, if they don't agree, it doesn't have any impacts on you directly in the way that it does now. And that's going to change incentive structures for violent behavior. Okay, so Keegan, when he was on, I mentioned him 3 times in this episode, so that's a hat trick for Keegan. He mentioned that he thinks people, he qualified it by saying it sounded corny, but he's like, people have a lot in common. And my feelings on this are really, I'm not sure what the barometer we should be using is to determine if people have things in common. Because it's very easy to spin a narrative where people have nothing in common, and it's very easy to spin a narrative where people have everything in common. Because we all care about our family, we all care about not starving, we all care about our kids doing well or whatever. All that stuff is fairly common across like a majority of people in our society, and probably most societies. Now, if you go to a state or a city that is not your political party, 80% to 20%, and then you ask like 3 prime political questions to them, even if they're relatively apolitical, you're going to quickly find that you don't have much in common with them about what the state should do, what government should allow, and what government shouldn't allow. And I think that's not negligible. It's easy to think that's not negligible if it's like everybody just wants higher well-being, everybody wants, to be happy. But it really, it's like if I walk up to people in Philadelphia and ask them a few questions, I'm more likely to find where I disagree with them, even if they're not a person who listens to news or listens to political philosophy as often as you and I do. So just because I could have a drink with somebody at a bar and randomly make a joke to a stranger if like somebody slips and we can make a comment on something, that doesn't mean we really have anything in common. Using that barometer is like convenient, and it does mean something. It means people don't inherently hate each other. It means people are willing to joke around with other people. And it means a lot of people have similar incentive structures. It doesn't mean that we should be ruling over each other. And that's really what my takeaway would be. It's like really arbitrary that if I asked everybody in Philly a few questions, I'd find 80% of them think the world should work in a way that I don't think it should work. And maybe if they were in their own region and they could only govern themselves and they didn't have any power over people in other places, then it's like, then I can move and then things would actually be better. But because of the way the federal government works, if I move, things don't get that much better. It's like the variance is much lower state to state in terms of policy because of mandates that are nationwide. And it's like, that's really bad for people who feel disenfranchised. So I think I think I got that across. But that is something that people say a lot, because there's all these books coming out about America being polarized, and there's all the people who are like Andrew Yang. They're like, no, we all want the same things. And in the end, it's kind of like, well, which barometer do you pick? I think the polarization barometer is much more convincing, because you and I both know it's true that if we talk to random people about politics, even if they're mostly apolitical, we'll be like, oh, you think the government should do all these things? What? And then like you ask a random, 60-year-old male something, and he's like, well, yeah, you shouldn't be allowed to smoke pot. And we'd be like, what? So it's, yeah, I guess that's my closing thought on it. You want to get another word in?
There's just two minor points. But one, I guess I would wonder how, even if Republican Town and Democrat Town come like are founded, I would still wonder about the disagreement within those countries, and I would still think that it's not necessarily. And I'm not trying to your argument's not this simplistic, of course, but we wouldn't want to simplify it and say that there would be no disagreement, politics would be irrelevant because everyone agrees and all the legislation is going to get passed. Like I think it would still be the partisan politics that we see in this country. And then the other thing is, I also think that the difference between, say, what China's doing or what Canada does versus what Republican Town and Democrat Town would be doing is the common history, again, I think would make it far more likely that there would be more conflicts, military or otherwise, between these two countries, right, that are right next to each other. So I just don't see it as something that's going to happen. Whether in, you can make a philosophical argument in favor of it. I don't see. And then what are you going to do? Like, what about the people that don't want to secede? Again, going back to the Civil War, what are we going to do with the government that, like, we're positing, of course, that like that everyone agrees they want to secede and then they secede. Like, what about the people that don't want to secede? Like, they're probably going to try to do something about it as well. All this conflict, like, I guess I don't mean to repeat myself, but what I'm really trying to say is, I think the idea of secession and balkanization is really an attempt to minimize conflict. And what I'm saying is that's an impossible goal. It's never going to happen. When we're talking about policy, when we're talking about politics, there's always going to be conflict, and you can't get away from it. And there are probably always going to be people that radically disagree with you within whatever jurisdiction you're in. That's just the nature of human beings. America is just a particularly diverse country, so we might feel it more for that very reason.
So I'm just going to address them in order. I'm just going to clarify some points I made. So the first thing was, everything I said was predicated on the idea of, yeah, of course, people will still disagree, but at least the Overton window of acceptable opinion shifts in the direction that the people are more predisposed towards in the region. And that in and of itself is more representative or better for those people's well-being. That's all. I know that the whole point is predicated on they'll still disagree, but it's just in the direction that both of the sides are more that they're more comfortable with. Okay. Second one, agree to disagree on probabilities of armed conflict in the 21st century between nations and things like that. That's an agree to disagree. I talk to people who have completely different views on this. This is just probabilistic assumptions. I have a different bar than a lot of people because of my opinions on it. That's all that is. And I guess the third point is you said if the goal is to minimize conflict, you can't get away from conflict, which is like, that's like an inherently a phrase that means nothing, because minimizing conflicts and getting rid of conflicts are completely different things. So, and short-term and long-term conflicts are completely different things. So balkanizing minimizes long-term conflicts. Obviously, you have to do something to get there. This is obvious. So I agree with you. I just don't think you maybe articulated that in a way that I thought made sense. Because it's like, yes, minimizing conflicts doesn't mean getting rid of it. Long-term and short-term conflicts are different. All these would be baked into the cake. I can't do the math on it because I don't know how people would react. That's a valid thing to worry about. So I'm with you there. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up?
This isn't actually about the topic we just said, but before Matt wraps up the show, as he always does, I want to tell people that I started a solo podcast myself, and it's not on Apple Podcasts, unfortunately, but it's on Spotify. It's on all kinds of others that I've forgotten. It's called The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. I've only put out 2 episodes. I'm going to try to put out roughly every week, one about an hour-ish. It's more philosophically oriented than this one is. I realize that, Matt here is not, he's interested in philosophy. He's just less interested in philosophy than I am. So this other podcast is my way of getting a lot of this other philosophical stuff that I have in my head out of my system that Matt just, wouldn't be interested in talking about. Not because he's stupid or anything, just because it doesn't interest him. So yeah, please go check that out. The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. I've also uploaded a couple of the episodes to my YouTube channel as well to give people a taste of what that will be like.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Okay, so just wrap up. Well, first off, I thought that was a pretty solid episode, because I like when we explore ground that is both contentious and it's both like thought experimenty in we're thinking critically about ideas removed from what they are, and you can draw things from that even if it's not about the policy of the day. Like, that's just a valuable exercise in thinking about things analytically. So I'm happy we got to do that, because we don't always tackle ideas that allow us to do that. So soon in the future, we'll do more from Michael Malice's book. Who knows if we'll do it next week, because we've been open to the idea of taking weeks off. So keep watching out for more of those. As always, you can find more episodes of Beyond Talking Points on YouTube on the channel Beyond Talking Points. You can also find on any podcatcher, Apple, Spotify, etc. All of those Beyond Talking Points is there. Whole backlog catalog of dozens and dozens of episodes you can watch where we cover all sorts of topics. You can find more of my content at the Obey Podcast. It's kind of like Matt's doing his on philosophy. I would lean more into current events, right? And I would lean into more of the, thinking our leaders are more malevolent and maybe some agendas and narratives. That's kind of what I talk about there. I have like 30 or so episodes of that. I'm hopefully going to get back in the habit of those every week in about a month or so. I've just had a lot on my plate lately. You can also find more of Matt's other content on the Anti-Philosopher YouTube channel. That's where he's posted other videos he's done, and his aforementioned podcast, The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. You can find on some of the podcatchers he mentioned. So yeah, awesome. I'm glad we got through this one. It's always fun. I'm glad this was longer than our last 3 episodes after we prefaced it with maybe this will only be half an hour or so, because that's just how it goes. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and signing off for now is Matt. Thank you.